About to get started here in just a moment. All right, welcome everyone to Social Impact Live. Durell Coleman here, your host. Today I'm really excited. We're going to start a series on social entrepreneurship and really answering this question of what is social entrepreneurship? It's this concept we hear thrown around all the time, but what does it really mean to be a social entrepreneur? What qualifies, what doesn't count? Those are questions that I'm going to be answering over the next few minutes here on this episode. So, let's go ahead and dive in. If you are new here, before we do that though, I'll say I go live daily to talk about social impact issues, to help you build social ventures and basically create a better world for other people. If that sounds interesting to you, then like, follow, subscribe, and I'd love to have you along on the journey. For those of you joining me live, welcome to the show. Looking forward to diving in deeper to what is social impact. So let's dive in right now. When we think about these two categories, we have social ventures, we have social entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurship and social enterprises, and then we have for-profit ventures. Those are going to be the two things that I'm going to be comparing today and contrasting to give you a little bit deeper dive into what is social entrepreneurship itself. The main difference between a social enterprise and a regular for-profit business ultimately comes down to the way that value is measured by these two entities, right? So that's the first thing to really take away from this, is that this comes down to how value is measured between the two. So how is value measured, as well as who is that value for, and then what is the state of the world the organization is actually creating after generating that value. So there are a lot of articles that talk about this concept, but one that I really enjoy that I think goes deep into this is one from the Stanford Social Innovation Review, where I'm also biased. I'm an alum of Stanford, and so I'm a fan of that particular magazine. But Stanford Social Innovation Review has an article called Social Entrepreneurship, the Case for Definition. And this article goes deep into this exact question. So I'm gonna pull some things from there, read some things from there, and tell you a little bit more about that. In that article, Roger Martin and Sally Osberg define social entrepreneurship as having three main parts to it. All right, and these can be a little bit lengthy, but these three parts I think are pretty key and pretty important. So I'm going to explain the three parts, and then I'm going to give you. I'm going to break that down a little bit, and then I'm going to give you some examples of actual organizations that fit these and don't fit these. So, what is social entrepreneurship? Social entrepreneurship identifies, they do these three things. So the first is that social entrepreneurship identifies a stable but inherently unjust equilibrium that causes exclusion, marginalization, or suffering of a segment of humanity that lacks the financial means or political clout to achieve any transformative benefit on its own. So that means that ultimately social entrepreneurship is focused on saying, okay, there's a system that we have right now that's in place. There are parts to that system that are unjust. The equilibrium, the balance, the status quo, the norm that we have right now produces negative outcomes for people. How can we, social entrepreneurs, recognize that the status quo produces these negative outcomes and focuses in on those issues, recognizing that there are people who are disadvantaged by what we currently live in. The second thing is that social entrepreneurship identifies an opportunity in that unjust equilibrium and develops a social value proposition that challenges the status quo. So that means that they not only say, I recognize that there's something wrong with the system that disadvantages certain people, but they also recognize that there's something they can do about that. And so what they do is they create a social value proposition. A value proposition is a value that you offer to other people, right? So a social value proposition is what they create in order to challenge the status quo. So this is the second thing that social entrepreneurs do that defines them as being social entrepreneurs. And then the third thing is that social entrepreneurship forges a new stable equilibrium that releases trapped potential or alleviates the suffering of the targeted group while helping create a better future for those individuals. So not only does a social entrepreneur identify a problem that is a problem, not only do they offer something that changes and affects that status quo to alleviate the suffering of the group that is suffering because of that status quo, but they also work to create a new paradigm, a new alternative, a new stable world where those people can continue to benefit and build a better future for themselves. So those are the three things that really define social entrepreneurs and what social entrepreneurship is in the first place. Right. So let's go a little bit deeper into what this means, and let's break this down so that it's a little bit easier to remember, because it's kind of hard to remember those three concepts every single time, but you will see them pop up over and over again. Right. So here's what I would say. The critical distinction between entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship comes down to the value proposition itself. Right. The value proposition itself. For the entrepreneur, the value proposition is focused on making as much money as possible by providing value to a group of people who can comfortably afford a new product or service. So someone who's launching a new business is typically saying, I want to offer you something, and I'm going to offer that to people who can afford what I have to offer. It is going to address some sort of problem for them, but the way that I measure the value is actually going to be different than a social entrepreneur would. So a real estate business that sells homes to middle and upper class families is a for-profit business. A coffee shop chain that provides coffee to the masses is a for-profit business. A tech company that sells computers is a for-profit business. All of these are for-profit businesses, and social ventures can be for-profit businesses, as I'll talk about in a moment here. But so that's not the thing that distinguishes them or makes them social ventures. But what it comes down to is this idea of value. So while you can argue that the real estate company I mentioned, that the coffee shop and the tech company, that those are all providing value of some sort, that they're solving a problem and that they're improving lives, what distinguishes them from social enterprises is that the primary way that they measure value is by measuring the profit that the business makes itself. Okay, so the primary way that a real estate company or that a coffee shop or that a tech company measures the value that they offer to society, the value that they create in the world, is through how much money they as a business bring in to that business, right? That is how they measure it. So let's compare that to a social venture so we can understand how that is different, right? A social enterprise measures value differently. And the way that it does that is by focusing on the social issue. So since social entrepreneurs and enterprises and social entrepreneurs and the enterprises they build are primarily focused on transforming these unjust systems that cause the exclusion, marginalization, or suffering of people, their primary measure of value isn't in the amount of money that the business makes, but it's actually in the social returns achieved through their work. Okay, what are they producing in society at large is the question. That is how the value is measured. And while they may be a for-profit venture, they may make money, they may make a lot of money, the primary goal of the organization is to alter and address a social ill, an unjust aspect of society that marginalizes, excludes, harms, reduces the quality of life of a given group of people. So here's an example that is pretty famous. It's an older example, and I think it really fits into those three things that I mentioned earlier as well, those three characteristics of a social enterprise. So Grameen Bank is an example that is quite famous in the social entrepreneurship space. So they call themselves the bank for the poor. And their founder, Muhammad Yunus, had this idea of offering really small loans of $27 to low-income women in Bangladesh. That was his idea. And basically, he was noticing a challenge, a problem that these women had. They lived in poverty. They didn't have the means to change their status quo in any way, shape, or form, and were experiencing the effects of living in poverty, right? The suffering that comes from that that state of existence often, right? So what happened when he gave these women this money is that they used the money to invest in themselves. And they also invested specifically in their own ability to make money and lift themselves out of poverty. Right? These were choices that these women themselves made. And so they purchased things like sewing machines and other devices that they could use to make back the loan money they received from Muhammad. And in the end, they all paid the money back. It was something like 46 women who received this loan money, and they all ended up paying it back. And it was only $27, right? So for Muhammad, who came from a different environment, it wasn't that much money. But the impact on these women was that they were able to create new ways of generating income for themselves. They were able to generate money that they never had before. They were thus able to buy things that they couldn't buy before. They were able to lift themselves higher or further out of poverty than they had been prior to that. So with this example, ultimately what Muhammad did was he identified that there is this system in place that that locks people in poverty, keeps people in poverty, doesn't allow them to move out of that, and that's the status quo, and that's the status quo that we live in around the world in a lot of ways, in a lot of situations. The second is that he recognized that there was something he could do about it, right? And so he said, I'm going to offer these loans, and I'm going to see what happens when I offer these loans. If these women don't pay back the $27 that I'm giving, then we'll learn that didn't work out. But they did pay it back, and they did also improve their own quality of life from that, right? And then the third is that what happened after Muhammad did this experiment is he founded Grameen Bank, and that bank went on to give microloans to tons of people who live in extreme poverty around the world, many of the world's poor, and inspired an entire movement of microcredit organizations that lend small amounts of money to the poor, right? And so what he did was he helped set up that alternate ecosystem, that third pillar of what a social entrepreneur is focused on, which is creating a different world that continues to support those who have been helped and help others along the way. So while this is just one example, what I think is important here is that what's being measured in this example is the amount of money that would be lent to the poor, the number of people served, the increase in those people's quality of life. Those are the measures of the business's success, the organization's success. It's not how much money Grameen Bank has made in its loans. I mean, that might be a part of its measurement, but its primary focus is alleviating poverty around the world, right? And you can see the difference between that and the coffee shop or the real estate firm or the computer company, right? The tech company. Similarly, an organization, just giving you a different, quicker example, similarly, an organization that provides job training for the homeless, right, might measure how many people it's trained and how many of them have found and kept jobs afterward. And that might be the measurement that it uses to capture value. Maybe there's a way that training organization makes money. Maybe it makes money off of government funds that come in. Maybe someone else pays for this training. Maybe people pay back the training years down the line. Maybe there's some sort of sustainable and income generating approach or methodology behind that, which is perfectly fine. That has nothing to do with whether it's a social enterprise or not. But the ultimate measure comes down to who's being trained, what's happening with them and their quality of life. So social enterprises are invested in the people, and the returns for the people are the primary measure of the returns for the enterprise. There's a final example I'll give you. It would be my own company, DC Design. We noticed a couple of problems along the way. So one of the things that I should say that I noticed whenever I founded the company, right, was that there are big social problems that remain unsolved for those who are most in need. So this is something that's really important to me. It's been important to me for a really long time. And that was me recognizing there are systems in place that continue to perpetuate a number of the challenges we face in criminal justice and foster care and healthcare and education and all of these spaces. And it doesn't feel like we have the firepower pointed toward those problems to really address them. Right? The second part of this problem was something that I recognized, that mission-driven organizations working on those problems often don't have the outside support they need to overcome the issues that they are working to address. And ultimately, that leads to a challenge for them as they try to create change in the world. right? So looking at these two problems, looking at this sort of status quo within the system, I founded DC Design to help those who help those in need. I help the helpers. We help the helpers. We help the people who are on the front lines doing this work right now. And my team and I work together with governments, foundations, and nonprofits to develop better strategies for tackling problems like mass incarceration and the quality of life for foster youth, and access to information and training and resources for immigrants, and an educational system that isn't preparing our youth to be innovators in the future, and the black-white wealth gap in America, and more. So we work with these organizations to target those issues, to develop better strategies. And then we work with them to design new services, new systems, new procedures, new events, new interventions that alter those outcomes, that reduce the wealth gap, right? That increase innovation for youth, that increase the access to information for immigrants, that increase quality of life for foster youth. That is the work that we do. And in doing so, we are helping to fortify an ecosystem, because those organizations already exist. Those organizations have been there and will continue to be there. So we are helping to fortify an ecosystem whereby the outcomes that we are helping achieve will be maintained over the long run, right? And so that is how we are a social venture, and we measure those outcomes by the number of organizations we've helped, and by the results that ultimately they are able to generate for the people they serve. How many people have been able to stay out of jail because of the work that we've done? How much has the jail population decreased, right? Those are the types of questions that we ask. How many foster youth have made it to college who wouldn't have made it otherwise, right? Those are the types of things that we're measuring. And it's fortunate for us, we get to measure the things that our organizations are measuring, so we're aligned with them. So that is today's episode on what is social entrepreneurship. What is this concept? And I'm going to be doing a series on social entrepreneurship as we go forward. It's something that is near and dear to my heart, answering lots of questions about that. If you have questions about social entrepreneurship, about what it means to create change in the world, please do submit them to me. You can go ahead and type them in the chat. If you're watching this on a replay, you can go ahead and hit #replay and then type the question there as well, and that will pop up on the channels. This is being shown on a number of different networks and channels right now. But I would basically love to know what you're thinking and how you're responding to all of this, so that I can create content that you appreciate and enjoy, and that's useful for you on your journey to create change in the world. But join me tomorrow for another deep dive into social entrepreneurship specifically, and I will see you there. If this is interesting to you and you haven't done this yet, what are you doing? Like, follow, subscribe. Come along with me on this journey, and I'll see you soon.